Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Al Cooley. I'm responsible for the intelligence product portfolio at Symantec, which we take to market under the DeepSight brand. And with me today, sharing our virtual podium, is Jody Caldwell, who leads the customer success team for ThreatConnect. In this webinar, we're going to discuss how to fuse appropriate intelligence with a threat intelligence platform in order to thwart cyber attacks directed at your organization. So before we dive in, let me get a couple of logistical items out of the way. As far as questions go, we're going to go through the prepared material first and then take questions at the end of the presentation. But at any time during the presentation, if you have a question, just type it into the webinar UI. If we happen to run out of time, we'll answer any remaining questions after the webinar via offline media. We're also going to record the webinar, so that's an important point for folks to know. A link to the recording will be sent out after the event, so it'll be available for reference to you. As far as the agenda goes, we're going to begin by discussing how the changes in the cybersecurity environment are driving adoption of both threat intelligence and threat intelligence platforms, and some of the things you might want to consider should you decide to deploy a TIP. And then we'll go into a review of the types of intelligence available for integration and how you might want to think about picking the intelligence that's right for your particular situation. Then we'll go into a discussion of how you can effectively use a TIP should you deploy one. And of course, we'll conclude with questions. We have a reasonable amount of material today, so we're going to move at a reasonable pace, but I think that's good. Next slide, please. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone that the use of intelligence as an important element of organizations' security strategies has grown pretty dramatically over the last couple of years. Before the webinar, I was looking around, and the most recent survey I found on this topic was 2017, so pretty current. And it indicates that 60% of organizations are currently actively using intelligence. Now, depending upon the use cases implemented by those organizations, it gives them a variety of capabilities. Certainly, it helps them better detect attacks. Incidents can be investigated more quickly. It enables them to put in place effective countermeasures in advance of an attack and to provide more effective information to management. Now, typically, as an organization's intelligence program matures, their use cases expand, as does the number of intelligence sources they use to support those use cases. You can see this in the results from a study done a couple of years ago by ESG, who's a market research firm, and they're shown here on this slide. About half a dozen sources were being consumed on average by the sample of organizations used in this particular study. But as you acquire more sources, you run into a variety of management challenges, including how do you aggregate the sources, how do you dedupe them, how do you store the information, and so forth. And this is where a threat intelligence platform comes into play. Next slide, please. Threat intelligence platforms, or TIPs as the acronym is at present. TIPs enable organizations to make better use of their intelligence sources. A typical TIP will allow you to aggregate a variety of different sources, and that might include a commercial supplier of intelligence like Symantec, data from an ISAC or a government agency, maybe a national CERT, and your own internal sources, and then store that data for integration and use in your various use cases. And it will typically provide you tools to better understand and optimize use of the data, which might include filtering, visualization, correlation, editing the data, tagging, etc. And last of all, and very importantly, it can help you translate your intelligence into action by pushing the intelligence into the operational systems that you have in place, like SIMs, SOAR tools, and so forth. Next slide, please. To make your TIP deployment successful, there's a few things you might want to think about in advance. First of all, make sure you have a clear understanding of how you're going to use the tip and the intelligence you acquire to feed into it. If you've got a mature program and are just introducing the tip to improve existing operations, you'll already have those use cases and the operational interfaces in your organization identified. But if your program is relatively new, you'll want to make sure those are well defined. Now, based upon your use cases, you can then identify the categories of intelligence that you'll need. We'll discuss some of the categories in the next slide. And given specific categories or specific intelligence needs, then you'll want to pick the best source or sources. And we'll talk about a framework that you can use for doing that shortly. And of course, you'll want to select a tip that has the functionality you'll need to support the use cases identified. Next slide, please. As far as intelligence goes, there's a wide variety of content available. It can be categorized into two broad categories. On the left of this slide, technical intelligence, which tends to be electronically generated in near real time. And on the right, adversary intelligence, which is generated by analysts and tends to be more enduring in value than technical intelligence. In the technical intelligence category, network indicators like malicious IPs and URLs are very popular, very widely used, as are file indicators and vulnerability data. Popular use cases that we see include integration of indicators with security infrastructure that would include SIMs and networking devices, for example. And the purpose there is generally alerting and blocking. And then there's also a strong use around incident investigation. Now, as organizations mature their intelligence programs, they tend to broaden their use of intelligence to include adversary intelligence. And this category provides insights into the campaigns and techniques currently being executed by advanced groups. And of course, associated with that is technical indicators associated with the campaigns and so forth. And it also provides information on the groups themselves, the motivations, the affiliations, and so forth. With this intelligence, organizations can not only detect and block advanced attacks, but they can become more proactive in terms of understanding the adversaries, putting in place controls designed to counteract current techniques, and also providing executives with insights into the current cyber risk environment. Next slide, please. In my role here at Symantec, where I'm used as a consultative resource on intelligence, I've been fortunate to talk to a lot of organizations, including those that are both building out their first intelligence program as well as enhancing them. And many have selected excellent tools like ThreatConnect, so they're well positioned to do a great job on analysis. But often there's a question about what intelligence sources they should use. Now, there are quite a few options out there. There's just an example list on the left here. Most organizations, I think, recognize that if they use inappropriate intelligence sources, they're unlikely to get the results they want, despite their strengths in analysis. But on the right-hand side, you can see research by ESG. And that research, as well as my own personal interactions, indicate that many organizations have difficulty in determining which intelligence source or sources they should use. So next slide, please. So there's a couple of ways you can tackle this issue. You can certainly sit down and come up with a very thorough list of all the attributes you might want to compare if you're looking at selecting a source or a new source. In fact, if you do a search out on the internet, you'll find a couple of papers summarizing that approach. But if you look at those papers, you'll also see the studies applied a significant amount of resources to do that thorough analysis. And that's something that I found most organizations don't have the resources or aren't in a position to do. So a more practical approach might be to select those attributes that can be relatively easily measured with internal resources and combine those with some proxies for key characteristics that you can't measure very easily. So I'm suggesting, if you want to be more on the left-hand side of the spectrum, this is an approach. So in the next few slides, I'll outline 5 such characteristics you might want to look at, and then talk about some of the additional attributes you might want to consider if you can apply additional resources. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus the discussion on the most popular use cases, which revolve around using technical intelligence in conjunction with platforms like SIMS. But the same general approach can be used for other use cases and other categories of intelligence. So next slide, please. So the first thing you might want to look at is the provenance of the data. A good place to start is to understand the source or the sources of the raw threat data. Is it coming from community submissions, or maybe it's a side effect of the analysis conducted by incident response teams, or it could be generated by an installed base of products, say XYZ. You'll want to know specifically how the threats are detected within those sources. For example, if it's an IR team, how do they pull out those technical indicators? Is it through semi-automated analysis? How do they get them? Or if it's generated by real-time detection engines, you want to know that too. And the last thing you'll want to explore is how the data is processed after the threats are identified. Is there any process for validation, correlation, enrichment, and so forth? So this information that you get through exploring the source will give you insight into some of the attributes that are harder to measure directly in the initial stages of your selection. Just as an example, if threat detection is being done by the engines in product X, well, you could go look at the public testing reports for product X as a proxy for a direct quality measurement of the content. Another thing you can actually find out when you do this type of research is sometimes you can get insight into the long-term reliability of the data. I think you'll find that some sources, if you look at their history, you can find that they may have significant outages that you can uncover with a little research. So that's useful to know too. And last of all, this type of investigation will give you insight into whether the data source is going to give you broad, diverse insight into threats, or whether it's going to give you a narrow, constrained view because of the original source of the data. So next slide, please. So just to give you an example of how you might probe at this, this is how we generate our intelligence at Symantec. The raw threat data comes from 3 broad categories of sources, and we're on the left-hand side of the diagram now. The majority comes from our installed base of products. So that includes the Symantec endpoints, both on the consumer and enterprise side. There's a couple 100 million of those. Our attack centers, there's about 98 million of those. Our email, web gateways, and proxies, and those scan a large portion of the world's traffic. So that's one category. We also use some third-party arrangements to complement our own internal visibility, because as intelligence guys, we're always anxious to see more of the world's threats for our customers. So we do make use of third-party arrangements. And of course, down at the bottom there on the left, we have the analysts behind our adversary intelligence business. And those folks are doing collection of information through their interactions in online forums, through dark web interactions with government sources, social media monitoring, and things of that nature. So lots of raw threat data, a very diverse set of raw threat data. And so that data is fused together in a common data model in our big data warehouse, and it's enriched and then strobed with analytics in the case of the technical intelligence offerings we have, and that produces finished intelligence products, and those are delivered through the APIs we have to the ThreatConnect platform. Next slide, please. So we talked about, the first way you can explore, or the first characteristic you might look at in a source, that's the provenance of the data. So once you're comfortable with the provenance of the data, one of the easiest quantitative measures you can make is just the volume of indicators delivered over time. Now, we typically, when we're looking at an outside source, because like I said, we do use some outside sources, we typically look at least 30 days so you don't get any short-term perturbations. And if the data is a very large source, we try to break the source down into separate behavior categories so you can compare like sources. This is an example of a third-party analysis of our IP reputation data versus various open source options that were selected by the third party that did this analysis for us. And they broke down our data, which is shown here in the orange, into the different behavior categories. And we've got 7 abstract behavior categories, things like malware distribution, CNC participation, things like that. So you can compare like sources. And so this is just the volume metric of the different sources. And the volume metric, of course, gives you insight into the breadth of malicious behavior that will be delivered from the sources analyzed. So it's an important attribute, not the only attribute you want to look at, but certainly something that is worth taking a look at. Next slide, please. The next attribute, once you're comfortable with the first two, another attribute you can measure pretty easily is the freshness of the data. And this can be done 2 ways. You can look at an aging analysis, or you can do a churn analysis. Right here, I've shown an aging analysis because it's a little easier. And again, this is done by the third party, and these are 2 comparable sources. So it's the Symantec IP reputation malware behavior compared to another source that is malware distribution focused. What you can see here on the left is the indicators associated with malware distribution from the Symantec feed have a fairly short life because time is the bottom axis. That is, when you look at how long the indicators appear in the feed over a 30-day period, you can see that most are present for less than 5 days. So the data is really pretty fresh. This type of curve is pretty much what you normally see, that big lump on the left and a tail going out. I find this one to be a little more aggressive than I might normally see. I wouldn't normally expect to see the left side to be as high as it is on this particular sample, and I would expect the tail to be a little fatter and longer. But, the data is the data, so just want to give you an idea of how you might look at the data or look at aging. Now, in the case of the other source on the right, you can see that the indicators are served up over a longer period of time. So the curve is a more shallow belt curve. So that indicates that the age of the indicators, is more, probably about 15 days, it looks like here. So that gives you a relative comparison of freshness. And freshness is important, of course, as you're looking to understand and investigate the latest threat. So you don't want to be running after something that no longer exists or has been cleaned up. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at adding a new intelligence source to your program, of course, one of the things you're going to want to ensure is that it's adding value. And an important aspect of adding value is the contribution of unique intelligence content. So this can be measured relatively easily by comparing the indicators delivered in the new source to either individual components that you have or the sum of all your existing sources. So the first thing you might want to do is compare your new source to your existing sources to determine how many of the indicators in your new source are already present in your existing source. Again, use a reasonable sample period. So in this third-party analysis, the color coding on the graph indicates that the lighter the color is, that means your existing sources contain some of the content from the new source. And we can see in this particular example that only a small percentage of the deep side indicators are available in the existing feeds or the comparative feeds in the single-digit range. So in this particular analysis or case, deep side would add significant incremental visibility to your program. Next click, please. But of course, that's not the complete story. you need to look at uniqueness from the opposite perspective too, which is what you see now. In this case, we're looking at the percent of existing indicators that are contained in the deep site feed. So the opposite of what we looked at before. You can see the new that the new source, deep site in this case generally contains, looks like at least 65% or more of the indicators contained in the various existing feeds. So both of these are important ways to look at the data, and it'll give you a picture of the uniqueness of the content of the new source, and it's not a particularly heavy lift. And last of all, since I limited myself to 5 characteristics to fit into the time frame we had, I would suggest that you want to take a look at the depth of content of your new source. And the quickest way to do that is just grab the schema from the various existing sources and take a look at the content they deliver. And that's what we've done here. From an analysis perspective, you might want to organize the information into categories of content, which we've done here graphically. But don't get blinded by the categories, because some individual data elements may have much greater value than others. For example, if a particular source tells you an IP is bad, but it doesn't give you the context of what specific malicious activity it is or behavior it is exhibiting, it's hard to develop an appropriate strategy when it's detected in your environment without doing a lot of research. So having a detailed attack description might be very important to you. That's the highlight in yellow here. So, take a look at the content that is available and evaluate the differences for value in your use case. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned before, there are certainly other factors you might want to look at in evaluating a new source, depending upon your resources. From a practical perspective, many of these that you might want to look at might actually require deployment of the new source for a period of time. So examples of that would be the ease of implementation, the number of detections in your environment, and the false positive rates. Like I said, you can use proxies for those, like we discussed in the first criteria, or if you have more resources and time, you can test them as part of your evaluation, or you can put it into deployment and do a check-in point, say after a year, to see what those statistics look like. Now, there are some other less tactical considerations you could also look at. For example, do you expect this source to be around for a period of time, a reasonable period of time? Because you invest time to learn how to use a source and how to work with it. So you want to make sure that it's got some legs and you'll be able to use it over a reasonable period of time. And you may also want to look at, are there any synergies, that is, other services that would be helpful to you? For example, if you get a detection from this particular source, does the source provide you access to any services to do research around that particular incident to understand it better from a perspective of what that threat is about? But the important thing overall is to make sure that you select an intelligence source or sources that are going to deliver the content needed to get the value out of your investment in your tip and all the analysts that you have on your team. So content quality makes a difference. At this point in time, I think we've covered the first 2 topics on our agenda. So I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Jody, who's going to talk about how to effectively use this type of intelligence in your tip. So Jody, you want to take us away from here?
Yeah, sure, Al. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at. So the first thing we kind of want to talk about was to follow up on some of the things that Al has previously mentioned. And so the first slide really this graphic illustrates how intelligence flows through every aspect of your security program. It shows how your entire team is connected to the intelligence that's bringing in, no matter how many different disparate sources that you're bringing in. Aggregation is kind of the key phase of utilizing a platform. It also looks at the tools that are being utilized, and additionally shows a feedback loop from the people and tools that are built in to improve the intelligence. So looking at the graphic, the diamond in the middle, you'll see the threat intelligence creation with different sources of data from industry, premium threat intelligence feeds such as Symantec DeepSight, and then your own in-house created data, whether those things are coming from your particular incidents or blogs and other such things that your analysts are reading and creating, but also enriching as part of that process. And then to the right, some of the actions with orchestration, automation, workflows, and collaboration. So not only are you doing analysis on those items, but now it allows you to take action on those items that you've basically been doing the enrichment on and bringing in. And of course, the feedback loop through the entire process allows the organization to learn and benefit from things such as false positive observations, and then allows you to get value, as a return on investment on which sources are really giving you the more false positives and that you can probably thin out, and which ones are providing more observations and more value to your organization. Next slide, please. So this is just a basic use case for a current customer that we've kind of utilized, and it's something that we've just kind of talked about. In the bottom left corner, what you'll see is the disparate sources that are coming into the ThreatConnect platform. Some of the benefits of using ThreatConnect is you're deduping the indicators that you're bringing in. You're also rating them and enriching them. We'll touch on confidence and rating in a little bit, but basically it's going to allow you to take action on those high fidelity items that you're bringing in. And really what I mean by high fidelity in this case is now we're taking this particular use case and we're sending those indicators to the SIEM to basically get direct value. Now I wouldn't want to take 1 million or 2 million different indicators and send those directly to the SIEM. At that point, you're basically going to over-inundate your SIEM, but you're also going to over-inundate your personnel and your resources who are going to look into any cyber events and investigations. The team process allows you to regularly check in with the SIEM, and allows you to create custom dashboards and get latest intel from those sources. So within the sources, at this point, what we're able to do is filter based on rating and confidence, but also within the ThreatConnect platform, we're going to be able to say whether these indicators are active or inactive. And if they're inactive, then I don't want to send those things to the SIEM for collection. As far as benefits go, to the right, the threat intelligence team no longer is plugging in IOCs manually from reports, which can be very tedious and time consuming. This now provides the analyst time to actually do analysis and create their own intelligence based off of that analysis. And then finally, the ability to brief the value of the sources to leadership. Leadership always wants to see return on investment. So you want to, again, be getting valuable information from the sources that you're collecting from or paying for. All right, next slide, please. So here we're just basically going to walk through a basic use case. Earlier I'd sorted through some of the Symantec DeepSight data within ThreatConnect. As you can see, we'll drill into each one of these components if you're unable to see these. The bottom two charts I've enlarged on the incoming slides. But what we're looking at with the dashboard is particularly looking at the source of Symantec DeepSight data and the 7 behaviors on which they report on. Up in the upper left-hand corner, it's basically filtered by host and IP addresses. To the right, you're now looking at observations by indicator type. And then further over to the far right, you'll see the 7 different types, and I think there's 6 actually shown there, but the different behaviors on which they report on. I think the top 2 in this particular case are phishing and malware, and then I think third or fourth was command and control. But we'll go ahead and drill down into the two bottom charts real quick. Next slide, please. So this first chart we're looking at are recently added indicators from the Symantec DeepSight feed and the 7 behaviors. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, I think there's 229K results. Obviously, from an analytical standpoint, that's a ton of data to go through. And so how do you start to prioritize what data is important to your analyst? Because certainly, I don't think there's an analyst alive that's going to be able to parse through 229,000 results in a day. So we want to filter that number down. And so with the next chart on the next slide, please. So what we've done here is we went ahead and filtered this down by the listing ratio that Symantec DeepSight provides. The listing ratio basically shows over a rolling 90-day period how many times has this particular indicator showed up consecutively. Just as a starting point, I was able to create this dashboard. I put 30 days, so you could certainly do 7, 10, more if you wanted. Additionally, I went ahead and filtered down by a 5-skull rating. So those ratings are coming from DeepSight into the ThreatConnect platform. But again, I want to look at those critical items. If you're not familiar with the rating system within ThreatConnect, basically it's a 5-skull system, with the first kind of being unknown, so it's not checked. 1 skull rating is suspicious, a 2 is low, a 3 is moderate, 4 is high, and 5 is critical. So in this case, I'm looking for those critical things again. So I'm looking for high fidelity items that either I'm going to investigate or I perhaps want to send to my SIM or some other network device to take action and investigation on. The rating, which was not included in this particular filter, but the rating is the confidence from 0 to 100. How much confidence do you have in the source that is reporting the information? Okay, so what we're going to do is kind of do a deep dive into this based on the listing ratio of 30 days and a 5-skull rating. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, I've taken those 220-some thousand results and narrowed it down to 40 results, which is a much manageable number for me as an analyst to look at. Next slide, please. So this basically, I've kind of just selected an IP address to take a deep dive on. In this case, what you'll see in the middle column, which is the owner, the Symantec DeepSight, I think this was a command and control source that we were looking at. But the IP address has also been recorded by the ThreatConnect intelligence group and technical blogs and reports. And then the bottom two are Acme Core, which is the demo group that I utilize, and Common Community, which is all ThreatConnect customers. Okay, next slide, please. So once we go into an overview of this particular IP address, the 103 address, there's a couple of things I kind of want to orient you to, and really how we start to drill down in these type of things. The first that we're going to look at are Threat Assess and then the ThreatConnect Collective Analytics layer, which we call CAL. But they provide metrics that give users context and insights about the indicators that they're looking at. They serve different but also kind of complementary functions together. Threat Assess basically gives a basic risk assessment of an indicator through a single actionable score. So that's basically just looking at what the data that you have access to within your org. And in this particular case, you'll notice that whether there are any false positives or observations that are being recorded. Everyone's probably pretty familiar with false positives. In regards to observations, what ThreatConnect defines as an observation is data that is sent from the ThreatConnect platform over into a SIM, such as Splunk ArcSight or QRadar, for examples. And if that data is matching, so did they find some indicator based on the ThreatConnect data that was sent over? And that's what we call an observation. All right. Additionally, CAL provides anonymized data, crowdsourced intelligence derived from the global data for the indicator across all participating instances of ThreatConnect. So just keep in mind that this is more crowdsourced information that is anonymized, and what do we know about it collectively based on different ThreatConnect instances that are participating in CAL. All right. To the right, what we'll see is additional owners. So you start to see the threat rating and confidence rating to the right. Down below, kind of what I want to dive further into was the associations. So with the graphical representation that you'll see, we're going to zoom in on that. Next slide, please. You might want to go back 2 for me. All right, forward 1, sorry. There you go. So in this particular case, we've taken the graphic, and what I wanted to show was the different associations that ThreatConnect is looking at for this particular IP address. So in the middle was the IP that we derived from the Symantec deep site information. Now across all the sources that we're bringing into the platform, what collectively do we know about that particular IP address and how is it associated to other items? So what you'll see is everything in the green are tagged items that you'll see across other sources, which you can certainly filter on within ThreatConnect if you were just looking for items that pertain to that. The blue icons, you're looking at, I think it's an MD5 hash value and also a host over on the right. The two items I kind of want to focus in on were the orange one, which I've currently got highlighted, and the other one, which is another incident. But now I see that this IP address is tied to another incident that necessarily wasn't in the deep site data, but was reported by the ThreatConnect intelligence team. So once I kind of clicked on that orange icon, to the left, we have a pop-up that brought up some information. And so you start to see all these other hash values, and it gives you a good background information on what they know about this particular IP address. And it looks like, looking earlier, it was part of a spear phishing campaign targeting, I think, some Indian naval assets. But what I can do from here is start to dive into these different indicators. And from a incident response standpoint, now I'm able to look further across my network into all these other indicators and not just look at one independent IP address that may have came in. So it really shows you collectively how all the indicators are coming in, but also the associations that I'm able to build my investigation off of. And so that starts to speed up the incident response cycle, but at the same time, you're kind of gathering more information, which allows you to enrich your other indicators and build a more holistic picture. At this time, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kelly, who's been monitoring for incoming questions, and she can go ahead and take control of that. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Al. So we had a couple of questions come through. I'll read them off, and you guys can go ahead and take them as you see fit to answer. The first one that came through, when dealing with aging or expired indicators, how do you deal with the need for historical or retroactive reviews? Data may be currently expired, but when reviewing an incident from 6 months ago, you may need an older set of intelligence.
Sure. I can definitely answer that. So within ThreatConnect, there's a couple of things that you can do. There's a deprecation function within ThreatConnect. So what that does, it will only deprecate the confidence and will not deprecate the threat rating, so the SCOLA rating. So you have an option to filter on that by the particular source. The one thing that you're able to do is once the confidence gets down to 0, you have the option to delete that item or not. So in this particular case, an IP address probably we have less confidence in because we know that adversaries tend to change IP addresses, pretty regularly. But with the deprecation function, within ThreatConnect, we could use that. And what we would do is choose to retain that particular IP address. So we had basically some archive data and visibility on what that particular indicator was used for at a previous time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jody. Next question I think will be for Al. So I see how Deep Site gets new threat information, but how does it remove threats that are no longer active?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the benefits of having kind of a real-time collection infrastructure behind your intelligence is that the reporting sources that sent us that information are constantly updating the information. So when we see a particular entity behaving maliciously, we continually get the reports on that malicious activity until it ceases. And as Jody was pointing out, malicious activity comes and goes. So we're actually getting updates all the time, and we regenerate our intelligence several times a day. So what will happen is when something goes from exhibiting malicious behavior to no longer exhibiting malicious behavior, it'll stop reporting in. we get that automatically. And then with our algorithms, it will get aged out in a fairly short order. We don't drop it immediately when it stops misbehaving, because it's possible that, you know, some things misbehave in a sporadic fashion. So we age it out over a period of time that allows us to see whether it will misbehave again and should still be on our malicious list. But if it stays in a clean state, then it will end up getting dropped. So we don't have to guess at when something goes from being bad to good. We know.
Okay, great. Next question, Alex, is also going to be for you. So I like the availability of the detailed malicious behavior description in DeepSight, but it's not unusual to see a malicious entity exhibit multiple malicious behaviors. How is that handled?
That's true. It's true. You know, there are a lot of malicious entities that exhibit multiple behaviors. So we have in our schema, we organize things so that when we deliver information to you, we will deliver the entity, the summary information, and then all the malicious behaviors associated with it, along with all the detailed descriptions around each malicious behavior. So if you've got an IP and it's doing malware distribution, you'll have a whole set of information around that. And then if it is also exhibiting attack behavior activity, then you'll have a whole set of information around that. So we do correlate that for you and organize it for you, and so it makes it easy for you to take action on.
Okay, great. Next question that came in is for Jody. Is ThreatConnect cloud only, or do you offer more secure deployment models?
So there are a couple of different options available. There is public cloud, but we also offer a dedicated cloud and an on-prem solution are the two other options that we offer as far as deployment models.
Okay, great. This question could go to either of you guys. What would you recommend as the best way to prioritize threats or determine which ones are the most important ones to investigate first?
Well, Jody, why don't I take it first, and then you can kind of add on top? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Sure. So so when we you know, part of our algorithmic process of taking raw threat data and turning it into finished intelligence is we provide, along with the entity that we're reporting on, a variety of summary ratings. And so those would include overall reputation, a confidence score, a hostility score. We exhibit we list one of the 7 behavior categories. We kind of map individual malicious activity into those 7 behavior categories, and we give a hostility rating. So those are there so that you, from a policy perspective, you can take action on this entity as you want. So we give you all the ratings, and you can use those to organize your activities, filter on them, prioritize them, and so forth. And then ThreatConnect also makes use of those. So Jody, maybe you want to take over from here and talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, just as Al mentioned, a couple of things with, you know, we talked about those high fidelity items and the sources that I'm getting the most value out of. So the higher threat rating confidence are certainly there, but I would also say, you know, from an analytical standpoint and the business that you're kind of working for and supporting is, what are those business requirements? You know, are you a financial institution? And if you are, maybe you should be looking at adversaries that are focused on, you know, financial targeting and behavior, in addition to, you know, any priority intelligence requirements. Like, what are the things that really an adversary would target your organization for? So I think those would definitely depend based off of, you know, a retail market and a financial institution. So really knowing what the adversary is after is one easy way to focus on the data that you're bringing in.
I think at this point in time, I think we're running out of time. So I think what we'll do is close out the webinar at this point in time. Do want to thank everybody for joining us. We will send out a follow-up email with the recording. If you do want to take advantage of that offer, the email address will be there. You can also, if you're on right now and want to message us about it, that's fine too. But you can follow up with that email address, and we'd be happy to work with you on those trials. So thank you for your time today. Hope this session has been useful for you. We tried to pack a lot of information in to make it worth your while, and hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.